Hey everyone! Tonight we're drifting back to a quieter corner of the Middle Ages, somewhere in that soft twilight zone between folklore and reality, a place where royalty made questionable decisions and ordinary people dealt with the consequences of those decisions, usually with far more grace than anyone sitting on a throne. So, go ahead, settle in, dim the lights, get comfortable, and let the day melt away while we float into one of history's more curious anxieties, the fear of a woman being too beautiful. Because in the Middle Ages, beauty wasn't just admired, it was suspicious, potentially dangerous, sometimes even treated as a supernatural threat. A lovely thought to drift off to, I know. But don't worry, this journey is slow, quiet, and just a little sardonic. We're simply exploring what happened when a woman's appearance caused more concern than comfort, and how society reacted when someone looked, well, slightly too symmetrical for medieval tastes. Let's sink gently into the story. Beauty, in the medieval imagination, was a volatile thing. It could elevate a woman to the highest levels of society, swathed in silk and surrounded by admirers. Or it could lead her straight to isolation, suspicion, or exile. This depended less on the woman herself and more on the insecurities of the people around her, which, as you'll soon see, were abundant and dramatically fragile. And it's worth remembering, mirrors weren't exactly accessible. People relied on verbal descriptions, passing gossip, woodcut portraits that made everyone look like a startled eel, and their own, often very imaginative minds. So a woman described as too beautiful wasn't necessarily a medieval Angelina Jolie. Sometimes she was simply clean, or had all her teeth, or washed her hair more than twice a year. You know, the little luxuries that instantly raised suspicion. Let's drift a bit deeper into the world of these women, those whose looks became a problem. One such woman appears in the chronicles of 14th century France, though the chronicler politely decided not to mention her name, probably to avoid getting in trouble with her very irritated husband. She was the wife of a minor nobleman, and according to whispers in the local court, she was dangerously attractive. That sounds like a compliment. It wasn't. It meant she received attention, and the attention made powerful men uncomfortable. Mainly her husband, who, like many medieval men, possessed the emotional stability of a damp onion. He fretted. He panicked. He consulted a priest. He considered locking her in a tower, because that was the default medieval solution to everything. Child too energetic? Tower. Monk too rebellious? Tower. Wife too beautiful? Absolutely tower. Instead, he settled on forcing her to wear a veil so thick it could double as a winter tent. It covered everything except her feet, presumably because those didn't seem capable of seducing anyone. And while she went along with it, because refusing was not really an option, it didn't solve anything. Rumors spread faster. Everyone wanted to know why she was hidden, and, predictably, the mystique made her beauty even more legendary. This is how medieval logic worked. Hide something, it becomes more interesting, people assume it's dangerous. Naturally, they made it worse. Let's drift over to Italy now, where things were even more melodramatic, as they often were. Italian city-states were filled with rival families, political turmoil, and a general readiness to accuse anyone of anything, especially if it involved love, jealousy, or the faint possibility of witchcraft. One well-documented case involved a merchant's daughter in Bologna, known mostly for causing unrest among young men, which is a polite way of saying that teenage boys argued over her instead of studying. For this terrible crime, the city authorities briefly considered sending her to a convent for the good of her soul, which was medieval shorthand for please stop distracting the apprentices. Her beauty became such a civic problem that her father had to bring her everywhere with two older female relatives who acted as a sort of medieval anti-glamour squad. Their job? Make sure no one saw the girl alone, or smiling, or standing in direct sunlight, which someone claimed made her look supernatural. Truly, the human imagination is a wondrously inefficient thing. Of course, we can't drift through this topic without visiting medieval court life, where beauty became a sort of political hazard. Courtly love was popular, highly ritualized, and deeply impractical. A queen or noblewoman might find herself praised excessively by poets, minstrels, and knights who really should have been focusing on much more important things, like not dying in battle. This led to jealousy, and jealousy led to accusations. One French queen, Agnes of Morania, was described by chroniclers as being so beautiful that King Philip II essentially forgot he already had a wife. This was a slight issue because the first wife remained inconveniently alive, and the Pope, who tended to have opinions about these things, was not amused. Agnes's beauty became a political scandal, not because she did anything wrong, but because powerful men looked at her, made impulsive decisions, and then blamed her for their own choices. A pattern that repeats itself throughout all recorded history, and probably before that. Sometimes accusations of excessive beauty drifted into religious territory. In Northern Europe, a woman who attracted attention too easily might be suspected of using magic, because obviously, the only explanation for being attractive was demonic intervention. A few unlucky women were accused of possessing glamours, which in medieval belief was a sort of magical charm that made people appear more attractive. Instead of considering the possibility that she simply brushed her hair more often than the local average, neighbors leapt straight to sorcery. Investigations into such beauty-based suspicions were profoundly awkward. They often involved older men, local priests, clerks, or judges, sternly interviewing a woman about her face while pretending it was all very scientific. Do you intentionally make men look at you? How long have you been this aesthetically suspicious? Do you wash your face with enchanted water? All questions that actual people once asked with a straight face. Fortunately, most of these cases faded into nothing, because even medieval courts had limits. But the fear lingered. And then there were royal wives, a delicate subject. Kings needed heirs, they needed alliances, they needed stability. What they did not need, apparently, was a wife who looked even slightly better than they did. A famous example comes from the Byzantine Empire, where Emperor Romanus II married a woman named Thephano. She was widely described as stunning, a trait that made her wildly popular with the public and deeply unpopular with the palace staff. Thephano's beauty became a convenient scapegoat for everything that went wrong in the empire. Taxes rising? Blame Thephano. Military officers mutinying? Must be Thephano. Bread prices increasing? Definitely Thephano. In reality, she was navigating a vicious political environment while married to a man who spent more time hunting than ruling. But beauty was easier to accuse than incompetence. And so, when rivals wanted to undermine her, they whispered. They suggested her beauty was manipulative or dangerous or a sign of moral corruption, because nothing frightened medieval elites more than a woman people actually liked. Let's gently float to Northern Europe again, where things were simpler, colder, and regrettably, not much kinder. In certain regions of Scandinavia, local laws allowed husbands to demand penalties if another man complimented their wife too enthusiastically, which raises many questions, such as, what was the line between casual admiration and legal offense? And how did they enforce it? Well, badly. as you might expect. There's one case in which a man was fined for describing a woman's hair as bright, which apparently implied attraction. Another man avoided punishment because he claimed he was merely admiring the craftsmanship of her braid, not her actual head. It was a strange world. But for the women at the center of these incidents, life became uncomfortable. They were pressured to remain indoors during feasts, told to dress in a way that concealed anything remotely eye-catching, and sometimes warned, gently but firmly, that their existence was a public distraction. It was not a compliment. It was a burden. There were also women whose beauty genuinely sparked political chaos, through no fault of their own. Eleanor of Aquitaine, for example, was admired for her
charm, wit, and elegance, but the combination made her enemies uneasy. They couldn't accuse her of wrongdoing outright, so they targeted her appearance instead. One chronicler described her as too worldly in her beauty, whatever that means. Another called her dangerously graceful, which sounds like a review for an expensive furniture store. Regardless, the message was clear. She was a woman who drew attention, and that was a problem. She was blamed for political tensions, military failures, and even her own son's rebellions. Because, naturally, if men made poor decisions, it must have been caused by someone else's face. And then, of course, we arrive at the most tragic category of all, the women whose beauty drew the king's attention and destroyed their lives. Being noticed by a king was not romantic. It was a logistical nightmare. It came with jealousy from queens and noblewomen, suspicion from clergy, and heavy expectations from ambitious families. One English noblewoman, rumored to be extraordinarily beautiful, briefly caught the king's eye at court. This was enough for her relatives to panic, drag her back home, and, according to local accounts, hide her in the countryside until the king forgot she existed. Her beauty had become a political threat. She was safer in seclusion. Because sometimes the worst thing that could happen to a medieval woman was being seen. And so, when we ask what happened to medieval women accused of being too beautiful, the answer is many things, none of them particularly fair, or logical, or flattering to the people doing the accusing. Some were veiled, some were hidden, some were forced into convents, some were accused of witchcraft, some were blamed for political decisions made by men who should have slept more. Some had their reputations twisted, some simply endured. Beauty was not a blessing. It was a liability, a cause for suspicion, a story others wrote about them, usually without their consent. And yet, these women existed, smiled, lived, persevered, sometimes quietly, sometimes boldly, always within a world determined to misunderstand them.
Drifting through the lives of two beautiful women, court intrigue, quiet exile, and the soft politics of appearance. Hey everyone, welcome back. Take a slow breath. Let the room settle around you. And if you're listening in bed, this is a good moment to loosen your shoulders, ease into the pillow, and let your mind drift as we continue our quiet walk through medieval anxieties about beauty. In this part, we're going to move a little deeper into the private world of these women, their routines, the whispered gossip surrounding them, the fragile egos of the men who judged them, and the strange little rituals society invented to protect itself from someone being perhaps a bit too pleasant to look at. Nothing dramatic, nothing loud, just a soft meander through the dim halls of European courts where insecurity lingered in every corner, and the definition of too beautiful changed depending on who was feeling offended that day. So let's drift back in. One of the quiet truths about medieval beauty is that it was rarely about the woman herself. It was a projection, a canvas for everyone else's fears, hopes, or frustrations. Beauty could mean prosperity, or temptation, or danger, or simply the misfortune of being noticed by people with a little too much free time. Take the case of a young woman from Burgundy whose story we know only through a monk's diary. The monk never bothered to record her name, because, of course, he didn't. But he did write an entire section complaining about her unsettling prettiness, which seems like a detail he might have enjoyed describing more than he wanted to admit. She lived near a monastery and occasionally passed by on her way to the market. This, according to the monk, caused disturbance among the novices. The disturbance was not her fault. Nor was it particularly surprising. The novices were teenage boys who had taken vows they were still trying to understand. But instead of acknowledging this, the monk scolded her in writing for walking too gracefully, as if she had malicious control over her joints. Of course, the solution he proposed was simple. She should avoid passing near the monastery entirely, because obviously the problem was her legs, not the lack of supervision inside the cloister. There is no record of whether she complied. History tends to lose interest in practical outcomes when there's moral anxiety to dwell on. Let's drift softly over to England now, where one noblewoman became so admired for her looks that her own family began rationing her public appearances, as though she were a rare commodity that needed careful preservation. Her name was Marjorie, an entirely normal, respectable name, but chroniclers insisted on calling her Marjorie the Fair, which, after enough repetition, started sounding less like a compliment and more like a brand. Her father used her beauty as a political tool. She was paraded at feasts, introduced to envoys, and displayed during major gatherings like a very graceful piece of furniture. All of this would be unsettling enough on its own, but the trouble began when her beauty outshone that of a visiting countess. The countess, unfortunately, had the personality of a cat that has just fallen into a pond. She was unaccustomed to being ignored, and so she did what many medieval aristocrats found therapeutic. She complained dramatically. She whispered that Marjorie must be enhanced, perhaps magically or improperly, or by sinful vanity. And these rumors spread, because, as anyone from the Middle Ages could tell you, nothing travels faster than a mildly jealous rumor. Soon, Marjorie was pressured to dress more modestly, which in medieval fashion meant adding enough fabric to qualify as light upholstery. Her mother supported this, mostly because she feared political backlash. Her father opposed it because he was still banking on alliances formed through enthusiastic admiration. Marjorie, caught in the middle, did what most medieval women did when men argued about their lives. She stayed quiet, she adapted, and she endured. The chronicler who recorded her story noted that she eventually retreated from public life, described politely as embracing seclusion, which is medieval shorthand for she got tired of being stared at like a decorative statue. As we drift onward, let's step into the Byzantine world, where beauty was treated with equal parts admiration and suspicion, especially among imperial families who believed they were one minor scandal away from the apocalypse. In this environment, a court lady named Zoe was both admired and resented. Not to be confused with Empress Zoe, this was another Zoe, a lady-in-waiting whose beauty was described as radiant enough to trouble the palace. A rather dramatic phrasing, but Byzantines were known for their flair. Her problem was simple. She looked too good in candlelight. This apparently caused lingering glances from courtiers, which in turn caused criticism from older noble women who felt she was disrupting the proper order. Zoe herself did not seem to encourage any of this, but quietly existing sometimes was considered too bold. The Empress, worried about palace gossip, assigned Zoe extra duties that kept her away from public ceremonies. She was placed in charge of managing storerooms, an incredibly dull task involving inventory lists, grain measurements, and supervising servants who spent half their time napping in corners. This was not a punishment per se. It was simply the court's way of containing a perceived problem without admitting they were insecure about it. A classic Byzantine solution: redirect the issue into bureaucracy until it suffocates under paperwork. Modern people react similarly, just with spreadsheets instead of parchment. Now let's drift north, to the colder edges of medieval Europe, where beauty wasn't always seen as a gift. In some regions, it was considered a potential curse, something that could attract not just human attention, but supernatural misfortune. A woman in rural Denmark, according to a local folklore recorded centuries later, was considered so beautiful that villagers believed she must be in league with elves, which, to be fair, was one of the more charming accusations available. To protect the village, or perhaps to protect themselves from feeling insecure, the elders encouraged her to wear a red kerchief whenever she went outside. Red, they believed, scared away magical creatures, and also men with overly enthusiastic imaginations. So, she wore it.
Bright, practical, slightly absurd. And after years of this social ritual, no disasters occurred. The crops grew. Livestock remained healthy. The village prospered. Naturally, this convinced them the kerchief was working. She had simply been folded into the folklore, like an unwilling character in a story everyone else preferred to believe. Let's drift now to the quieter corners of royal courts: bedchambers, private gardens, small libraries, where two beautiful women often hid from attention. Many noblewomen learned early that beauty was a double-edged sword. They were praised publicly, then critiqued privately. Admired in one moment, resented in the next. Some retreated into hobbies: embroidery, reading, collecting devotional trinkets, walking in gardens at dawn when everyone else was asleep or hungover from the previous night's banquet. Court chroniclers occasionally describe these women as melancholic, but the truth is simpler. They were tired. Beauty had become work. They lived under scrutiny, and it wore them down. A woman named Matilda of Saxony was known for avoiding feasts entirely. She disliked being seated at the high table, where everyone could see her. She preferred sitting in a corner with her maidservants, listening to music while quietly unraveling threads from a tapestry she never finished. People interpreted her shyness as aloofness or pride, because when you're viewed as a symbol, your real personality rarely survives the retelling. In some cases, being too beautiful drew attention from kings, and as we mentioned earlier, this was rarely a good thing. There's a case involving a woman named Jean who caught the eye of a French king purely by accident. She wasn't trying to be noticed. She was simply standing near a fountain when the king walked past. This is all it took. The king asked questions. Nobles whispered. Jean's family panicked so thoroughly that they moved her to a relative's estate in the countryside before the king's interest could develop into something political. She later married a minor nobleman, lived quietly, and never returned to court life. To outsiders, it appeared peaceful, but it was peace born from careful avoidance. Her beauty had redirected the trajectory of her life without her ever lifting a finger. A strange thought, that a single glance could reshape a future. And perhaps the saddest stories involve the women who tried to change themselves to escape the burden of beauty. Some intentionally wore drab clothing. Others covered their faces with simple veils. One noblewoman even began applying a mixture of ash and oil to dull the glow of her skin, a very medieval version of "Please stop looking at me." There are no dramatic endings to these stories, just quiet resignation. Practical choices made within rigid expectations. Small acts of self-preservation. And so as we float toward the end of Part 2, we begin to see a pattern forming gently in the background. Medieval women accused of being too beautiful weren't celebrated. They weren't envied in a glamorous way. More often, they were confined, hidden, burdened by attention they never asked for, turned into symbols for other people's emotions, navigating a world that believed appearances could topple kingdoms. Beauty, to medieval society, was not a gift. It was a complication, a vulnerability.
Quiet consequences, jealous queens, awkward clergy, and the strange rituals built around beauty. Hey everyone, welcome back. If you're still awake, congratulations. If you're drifting in and out, that's perfectly fine too. This part is designed to feel like sliding a little deeper under a heavy blanket while wandering through another dim hallway of medieval society where beauty, suspicion, and insecurity intertwined in endlessly creative ways. Tonight, we drift a bit further into the quieter consequences faced by women labeled too beautiful, the jealous glances they endured, the whispered politics, the unexpected dangers, and the strangely bureaucratic ways medieval people tried to handle the problem of a woman looking slightly nicer than they were comfortable with. So let your breath slow, let the story soften, and we'll step gently into the next layer. Let's begin with jealous royalty, a classic genre of medieval chaos. Because nothing complicated life more than accidentally being more attractive than someone with a crown, an ego, and too many attendants encouraging their worst impulses. Take Queen Isabel of France, for example. She was not unkind, she was not unreasonable, but she had the misfortune of being intensely insecure, possibly because her husband, King Charles VI, spent half his reign suffering from severe mental illness and the other half making questionable personal decisions. At her court served a lady named Blanche. Blanche was described not as gorgeous, but as striking, a term medieval writers used when they weren't sure if they liked someone, but felt obligated to acknowledge the obvious. Isabel, unfortunately, took striking as a personal challenge. She viewed Blanche as a potential threat, not because Blanche behaved improperly, but because Isabel feared being overshadowed even slightly. So she began implementing small, petty restrictions. Blanche was not to wear silk on feast days. She was not to sit near windows where sunlight might enhance her appearance. She was advised, ever so gently, to remain near the older ladies at gatherings as a form of aesthetic camouflage. It sounds humorous, but for Blanche, it meant navigating court life like a moving hazard. One wrong compliment, and she could be reassigned to a distant estate for her own peace, which was royal code for, "Please go away so I can feel better about myself." Jealousy may be quiet, but in royal courts, it shaped far too many destinies. Now let's drift to Spain, where the clergy took a more earnest, if unintentionally comedic, approach to regulating beauty. A bishop in Castile once wrote a letter complaining that several women in his region were distractingly radiant, a phrase that suggests he might have been dealing with issues unrelated to theology. He urged local leaders to encourage modesty in appearance,
which quickly turned into a set of guidelines that sounded more like a medieval fashion disaster checklist. No colorful ribbons, no patterned veils, no jewelry that sparkles, glimmers, or glints unnecessarily, and absolutely no embroidered shoes. Not because the women were doing anything wrong, but because beauty was seen as spiritually dangerous to men, who apparently had the self-control of poorly trained puppies. One local woman, who had the misfortune of owning a naturally elegant posture, was gently warned by the bishop not to walk too gracefully because it invited contemplation. A delightful euphemism. Even better when you realize the bishop wrote this after observing her for an uncomfortably long time during Mass. If this feels hypocritical, well, medieval clergy were often human first and clerical second. And humans, as we know, are prone to inventing rules when they don't want to confront their own feelings. Let's drift to another quiet corner of Europe, Hungary, where beauty had a different consequence: political usefulness. In some royal courts, the king's advisors encouraged the presence of beautiful women as a kind of diplomatic prop. Their attractiveness was supposed to create a pleasant environment, distract visiting envoys, and make the court appear prosperous. This meant that some women were chosen specifically for looking too good, and then used, quietly, indirectly, to create favorable impressions of the kingdom. One such woman was Ilona, a noble daughter with honey-colored hair and a face chroniclers described as calming. Her job wasn't to speak, or to dance, or to interact. She simply had to exist pleasantly in the background during negotiations, like a very elegant candle. This was seen as harmless political strategy, but behind the scenes, it made Ilona deeply uncomfortable. She had become a symbol, not a person. And once a new treaty was signed, her usefulness faded. She was married off to a minor knight in the countryside, a man who apparently had the conversational skills of a lukewarm bucket of water. Beauty had given her a brief moment of importance, then quietly taken away all her choices. Now, drifting eastward, we find ourselves in the courts of Poland and Lithuania, where noble families took a more superstitious view of beauty. It was widely believed that women who were too beautiful could attract not only human envy, but also the attention of mischievous spirits, mainly strigi and vili, which were forest entities blamed for everything from livestock illness to sudden headaches. A young woman named Danuta was believed to be at risk of spiritual interference because her eyes were a bright shade of gray, which villagers interpreted as enchanted. To keep her safe, her family insisted she wear a tiny pouch of herbs tied to her belt: lavender, mugwort, wild mint, a mixture believed to confuse wandering spirits by overwhelming their sense of smell. It smelled quite nice, actually, but its real purpose was social, not supernatural. It signaled, "She is protected. Do not gossip. Do not accuse." Because beauty could be dangerous, but being accused of supernatural beauty, even worse. At this point, you may notice a gentle theme. Beautiful medieval women were constantly managed, adjusted, rearranged, hidden, displayed, explained, protected in ways that were not very protective, condemned for things they could not control. Beauty was treated like unstable magic, powerful, unpredictable, and in need of regulation. Let's drift now to the quietly tragic side of these stories. Sometimes a woman's beauty became a weapon used against her. In certain inheritance disputes, relatives would argue that a woman was unnaturally attractive and therefore had undue influence over her father, brother, or husband. This argument occasionally held up in court. There was a case in Provence where two brothers claimed their sister, Madeleine, had manipulated their late father into favoring her in his will. Their evidence? She was attractive, and the father occasionally gave her nicer gifts, which to most modern readers looks like normal familial affection. But in medieval courts, emotions were considered unreliable. Beauty, however, was seen as dangerously persuasive, so the brothers leveraged this bias, and Madeleine lost a portion of her inheritance simply because the judge believed beauty could override paternal judgment. She appealed. She lost again. Not because she was guilty of anything, but because beauty was treated like a suspicious character witness standing behind her whispering advice. Let's move gently to a more ironic example. The queens who were accused of being too beautiful by people who had never seen them. This happened surprisingly often. Travelers exaggerated, poets embroidered their descriptions, envoys added embellishments to impress their own courts, and suddenly a perfectly ordinary queen became known across Europe as the dazzling jewel of Christendom. The trouble began when foreign suitors or political enemies arrived expecting a goddess and found a perfectly normal woman who resembled perhaps a mildly concerned pigeon in certain angles. This mismatch caused diplomatic disappointment, which then caused grumbling, which then caused rumors, which then caused accusations that the queen's earlier reputation for beauty had been misleading. She was blamed for the exaggerations other people made about her. No one considered the possibility that medieval artists were simply terrible at drawing faces. By now, as we drift through these stories, we can see the strange ecosystem surrounding beauty in medieval life. Admiration that turned into suspicion. Jealousy disguised as morality. Superstition layered over insecurity. Political use followed by political dismissal. And stories that swallowed the real person entirely. Beauty was a social currency no one fully understood, but everyone feared losing control of. And the women at the center of it navigated this quietly, carefully, and often invisibly. The beauty that became a political problem, and the women who paid for it. Hey everyone, welcome back. If you're still with me, I hope you're comfortable, maybe a little drowsy, and ready to let your mind wander into yet another corner of medieval history that absolutely no one asked for, yet somehow explains everything. Tonight, we're continuing our slow drift through the strange and wearying world of women who were considered too beautiful, and therefore, in the eyes of medieval society, too dangerous. A charming worldview, truly. Nothing like blaming women for existing attractively. A medieval specialty. Let's float forward into a collection of stories where beauty wasn't a blessing, but a soft, shimmering curse that followed women into courts, convents, and in some cases, exile. Just breathe, relax, and let's wander. Now, by the late medieval period, the church had really perfected the art of worrying about women's faces. This was an era when officials were genuinely concerned that a well-placed curl of hair could destabilize an entire kingdom. Not even a dramatic curl, just a curl. There were sermons devoted entirely to side eyes. Clerics warned that a woman's gaze could pierce the soul of a godly man, which seems like more of a personal problem than a theological one, but who am I to judge? Let's drift into one of my favorite examples, a soft little disaster involving a noblewoman named Isabel of France. Now, Isabel wasn't dangerous in any practical sense. She wasn't leading armies, she wasn't running cults, she wasn't trying to overthrow her relatives. She was simply pretty. And that was apparently enough to cause several kings deep monastic despair. One chronicler describes her beauty as radiant, celestial, and utterly catastrophic to the moral health of Europe, which tells you more about medieval chroniclers than about Isabel. She was so admired that kings tried to marry her off with the same intensity one might use to rid themselves of a cursed artifact. Please, they all seemed to say, take this dangerously attractive girl away before she makes us think impure thoughts. We cannot have that. We are holy. But Isabel refused every political match. Not out of defiance, but because she simply wasn't interested in being shipped off to some faraway castle owned by a man twice her age who considered bathing an ambitious seasonal activity. She chose instead to commit herself to a life of piety. She founded a monastery. She lived simply. She prayed. She tried so very hard to exist quietly. This, predictably, did not work. Her vow of chastity only made her more alluring in the medieval imagination. Apparently, nothing terrified medieval men more than a beautiful woman they could not control. A woman who said, "I'd rather not marry," was to them roughly equivalent to summoning demons. Clerics insisted her beauty was a test. Courtiers whispered that she bewitched people simply by appearing in a corridor. Visitors described her as angelic, which is medieval code for "I'm blaming her for my personal choices." All Isabel ever did was decline a few political marriages and pray quietly in a corner. But in the medieval world, that was enough to earn the title of dangerously beautiful. It's incredible what passed for danger back then. A woman existing with a face. Let's drift onward, gently, to another unfortunate case. There was a young noblewoman in 14th century Bohemia named Blanca of Valois. She was described by several sources as so beautiful it was distracting, which again feels like a personal issue. Blanca married Charles, the future Holy Roman Emperor. He was not beautiful. He looked like he had been carved out of wet clay by someone who was distracted and deeply tired. But he was powerful, which was really the only quality medieval royalty valued. Blanca, meanwhile, became the unintentional target of political suspicion. It never occurred to anyone that Charles genuinely liked her. No, clearly she had bewitched him with her eyes, which apparently glowed, sparkled, shimmered, entranced, hypnotized, and I'm sure eventually shot lasers, depending on which chronicler you ask. People genuinely accused her of influencing politics through beauty alone, which is a fascinating accusation when you remember that medieval politics were often decided by which cousin hated which uncle on which Tuesday. Blanca was also blamed for diplomatic tensions, because when nations don't want to admit they're mismanaging everything, blaming a woman is a timeless classic. And yet, there is no record of Blanca manipulating anything. She mostly sat politely at court, learned the language, and tried to be a decent queen. But like all pretty queens, she became a symbol. Soft, silent, endlessly interpreted. Her very presence was enough to trigger suspicion, anxiety, religious commentary, and at least 2 diplomatic complaints. She died young, after years of being misunderstood, admired, and resented all at once. Her beauty, something she had no control over, became a political fault line she never asked for. Again, medieval beauty standards. A woman could not win. Too plain, she was mocked. Too beautiful, she was dangerous. Somewhere in the middle, still dangerous. Consistency, not a medieval strength. Now, let's drift toward a story that's quietly heartbreaking. The tale of Agnes of Dunbar, a Scottish noblewoman so admired that poets compared her to a sunbeam in the shadows, which, as you can imagine, caused immediate problems. Agnes was pursued by several noblemen, including one particularly moody earl who decided she was destined to marry him. She politely declined. He did not appreciate this. In medieval aristocratic logic, no often translated to, "I will now lay siege to your family home." And that is exactly what happened. Agnes was forced to take refuge in a fortress known as Dunbar Castle. The walls were thick, the landscape harsh, the enemy persistent. The siege dragged on and on and on. Weeks turned into months, all because a woman dared to be pretty and uninterested. Chroniclers wrote about Agnes standing atop the battlements, calm, resolute, wrapped in furs, watching the besiegers with what was described as serene indifference, which is probably medieval shorthand for she looked bored and annoyed. Her beauty became part of the story, embellished, exaggerated, mythologized. Poets insisted the enemy soldiers hesitated to attack because they'd caught sight of her on the walls. That seems unlikely, but medieval poets were not known for truthfulness or restraint. Eventually, the siege collapsed, not because of her beauty, but because of bad planning, poor weather, and the usual medieval incompetence. But the legend? That lived on. Agnes, the beautiful woman who defied an army. She probably would have preferred a quiet life, but history has never asked women what they wanted. Let's float onward, into slightly darker waters. Another woman whose beauty became a liability was Wealhtheow, a king from early medieval legend. Recorded in Beowulf, yes, but based on real oral tradition. She was the ideal queen in the eyes of her contemporaries. Graceful, composed, impossibly lovely. Which meant she was used, constantly, by the men around her. Wealhtheow was deployed like fragile diplomatic currency. Her marriage aligned kingdoms, her presence soothed political feuds. Her beauty made her, in a sense, ornamental, a living symbol of fragile alliances. But beauty is a burden when your entire identity becomes a symbol. In the stories, she hands out mead to warriors, smiling calmly while surrounded by men who believe they own her. She negotiates for her children's futures, knowing the entire kingdom sees her as both precious and powerless. Her beauty trapped her in a role she could never escape. Not a strategist, not a leader, just a serene ornament, expected to make dangerous men feel slightly less murderous. It's a reminder that beautiful queen was not a compliment. It was a cage. Let's drift a little further, gently, towards something even stranger. There was a medieval belief that excessive beauty was a sign of divine favor, but, simultaneously, that it was a sign of potential demonic influence. A delightful contradiction, very medieval. So when a woman was unusually beautiful,
Society faced a theological dilemma. Was she blessed or cursed? And naturally, they usually chose cursed because blessings imply responsibility. Curses imply you can blame the woman. One common practice was to send unnaturally beautiful women to convents, not because they wanted to be nuns, but because men didn't want to be around them. Some convents became filled with women who committed the great sin of being aesthetically pleasing. Imagine being locked in a stone building for decades because society thinks you're too pretty to exist outdoors. That was an actual medieval solution. Many of these women tried to fade into the background. Some prayed for their beauty to be diminished. Some used ashes as makeup to make themselves appear sickly or older. A few starved themselves slightly, not out of vanity, but out of fear. Fear of what beauty could cost them: a future, reputation, freedom. It is quietly devastating. Now let's drift over to a king, because kings always make things worse. King Philip the Fair of France, a man described as outrageously handsome, became paranoid that other beautiful people were inherently suspicious. A little ironic, truly. Philip passed edicts about excessive female adornment, which is medieval language for women should stop being more interesting to look at than the king. He disliked court ladies wearing jewels or break fabrics. He believed beauty turned them manipulative. This from a man who once started a major political crisis because someone made fun of his beard. Naturally, he blamed women for political disorder. Naturally, he completely overlooked the fact that he was the one causing political disorder, a classic royal pattern. Under kings like Philip, beautiful women at court were regulated, scrutinized, and periodically lectured on their duty to avoid temptation. Some received official warnings. Some were forced to wear more modest clothing. Some were removed from court entirely if someone important became infatuated with them. Because, historically, men have been very committed to punishing women for their own feelings. Let's drift now, slowly, to perhaps the saddest element of all this. Many women realized, very early, that beauty was not safe. A lovely face might get you unwanted suitors, religious suspicion, forced marriage, political exploitation, rumors, hostility, or even exile. Some women responded by hiding, literally. They avoided festivals. They wore veils even indoors. They walked with their heads lowered. They smeared dirt on their cheeks before going into public. Not because they disliked their appearance, but because the world did. Or rather, because the world didn't know how to respond to it with anything except fear, desire, control, and confusion, all of which women were blamed for. Beauty became a lantern that attracted every moth, and every hand eager to swat the lantern away. So what happened to beautiful medieval women? Some were admired. Some were feared. Many were blamed for things they had nothing to do with. Some were hidden from society. Some were used as political bargaining chips. Some were accused of witchcraft. Some were forced into convents. Some were placed under house arrest to prevent scandals. Beauty in the medieval world was not a gift. It was an unpredictable burden, heavy and fragile, shining and dangerous. And through all the stories, one message repeats. The world feared beautiful women more than it feared armies, and often treated them just as harshly. We'll drift deeper into this theme soon.
When beauty became a weapon, and the women who never meant to wield it. Hey everyone, welcome back. Settle in, adjust your blanket, maybe loosen your shoulders a little. We're drifting again, slowly, gently, further into the world of medieval beauty, suspicion, and the soft, weary absurdity of how societies handled women who happened to look, well, pleasant. If this is your first time hearing it tonight, don't worry. Nothing in the medieval world made sense anyway. You can jump in anywhere. So let's exhale, let the tension go, and let's wander deeper into the strange little labyrinth where beauty was treated as a political crisis, a moral weakness, a divine test, and occasionally a reason to start a regional feud. Tonight, we continue with the women whose faces drew attention they never wanted, women who were praised, blamed, adored, feared and mythologized, all without doing much more than waking up and attending breakfast. Let's drift.
One of the saddest patterns we see in medieval chronicles is how beauty was described like a fire. Warm, dangerous, potentially destructive, and always requiring supervision. A lovely woman was considered flammable, not because she would burn anything, but because everyone around her carried emotional torches and absolutely no sense of responsibility. Take Cunegunda of Hohenstaufen, a princess whose beauty was so exaggerated by chroniclers she might as well have been hand-carved by angels in their spare time. Cunegunda was praised constantly. Poets compared her to pearls, lilies, and, for some reason, well-polished shields. Medieval poets really struggled with metaphors that didn't involve warfare. But Cunegunda's beauty caused a problem the moment she became a marriage candidate. Kings wanted her. Dukes wanted her. Everybody wanted her. Which meant, naturally, no one could actually have her. Every time it looked like a marriage contract was settled, some powerful man would object. Not because he disliked the groom, but because he didn't want any rival dynasty to gain a dangerously beautiful woman. Beauty was considered a strategic resource. A lovely wife meant prestige, admiration, political charm, and medieval elites did not like sharing nice things. Cunegunda's marriage was delayed so many times that she essentially lost her youth, waiting for men to stop arguing about who deserved her beauty the most. No one asked her what she thought. Of course they didn't. This was the Middle Ages, when a woman's opinion ranked roughly between the house cat's concerns and the structural integrity of the stable door. By the time she finally married, the political value of her face had been thoroughly wrung dry. She settled into married life quietly, gracefully, and with the kind of inner peace that tends to indicate emotional exhaustion. Cunegunda's beauty didn't ruin kingdoms. Political insecurity did. But history, as always, blamed the woman. Now, let's drift a little further northwest, to England. The medieval English court had a particular weakness for accusing beautiful women of dangerous charm, which is a poetic way of saying someone important found her attractive and decided it must be witchcraft. Let's consider Alice Perrers. Alice started life as a lady-in-waiting and eventually became the mistress of King Edward III. And yes, she was beautiful. Chroniclers describe her as radiant, elegant, and suspiciously enchanting, which is medieval shorthand for we don't like that she has influence, so let's blame her eyelashes. Alice didn't set out to wield power, but proximity to a king tends to do that. She advised him. He comforted him in old age. She handled court petitions. She ran estates.
This, predictably, enraged the nobility, because the last thing medieval nobles wanted was a woman exercising power without their permission. They blamed everything on her. Inflation? Alice's fault. Military failure? Alice's fault. The plague? Probably Alice's fault if they could have proven it. She was accused of sorcery more than once, because when men don't understand why a king listens to a woman, magic is apparently the most logical explanation. When Edward died, Alice was immediately exiled, humiliated, stripped of property, and treated as though she'd toppled an empire with her smile. In reality, she was a competent administrator who kept an aging king company. But history tends to treat beautiful women like narrative devices rather than human beings, and Alice, unfortunately, was no exception. Let's drift to another corner of the continent, Italy. Italy, as you may know, has always been dramatically emotional. Even in the Middle Ages, they excelled in romantic catastrophes. One woman at the heart of one such catastrophe was Gualdrada Berti, a Florentine noblewoman. Her beauty, according to Dante and several others, was legendary. which means, in practical terms, that no matter how she looked, medieval poets collectively decided she was luminous. At a feast, a German emperor supposedly saw her and commented that she seemed a woman who could be easily persuaded to love. Her father, horrified by the suggestion, immediately dragged her forward and declared she was a paragon of virtue who would never dishonor her future husband, which is a very polite medieval way of shouting, "Stop looking at my daughter." Gualdrada's beauty was used by men as a moral prop, evidence of Florence's purity, evidence of aristocratic virtue, evidence of whatever idea they needed to prove at the moment. She didn't get to be a person. She was an allegory. Beautiful women often became metaphors, stories, symbols. Men projected their anxieties onto them like medieval cinema screens, flickering, uneven, occasionally on fire. Gualdrada lived a quiet, respectable life, while her face was used to fuel half a century of philosophical debates, which must have been exhausting. Let's drift to a quieter story, one that whispers rather than shouts. In medieval Iceland, there was a woman named Gudrun Osvjörsdóttir, described as the most beautiful woman in all the sagas. Now, sagas are interesting. They praise beauty and instantly punish it. Gudrun's beauty attracted suitors, yes,
But it also brought conflict, jealousy, and tragedy. Men killed each other over her. Feuds erupted. Friendships dissolved. She didn't ask for any of it. She was intelligent, articulate, thoughtful, yet every significant event in her life was blamed on her face. If men committed violence in her name, the sagas portrayed it as her fate, as though beauty itself generated conflict like a storm cloud. In truth, men simply used her as an excuse for their own pride. The sagas romanticize this pattern, but underneath, there's a quiet story of a woman who never got to choose her own narrative because her beauty wrote it for her. And that is one of the soft tragedies running through medieval history. Beautiful women were rarely the protagonists of their own lives. They were set pieces, catalysts, symbols, excuses. Let's drift now into the odd philosophical territory medieval theologians adored. There was a popular belief that beautiful women are placed on earth to test the resolve of men, which is a rather convenient belief if you'd like to blame women for every moral failure. One monk wrote, "Beauty is a snare laid by the Lord to strengthen the soul of man." Translated, if I'm tempted, that's God's fault for making her pretty. Another wrote, "Women fair of face are trials greater than hunger or cold." Apparently, he'd never experienced a Scandinavian winter. This obsession created an entire genre of moral literature advising men to avoid looking directly at a beautiful woman, to lower their eyes, to focus on the ground, to flee temptation like a fleeing squirrel. Women, meanwhile, were told to cover themselves for the sake of male purity. Beauty was not something a woman had, it was something men survived, which is an extraordinary reinterpretation of basic biology. So what did all this mean for medieval women who happened to be notably attractive? Let's drift through the quiet consequences. Many were married off earlier than their peers because beautiful daughters were economic opportunities. Others were closely monitored, watched for signs of inappropriate interest, which could be as simple as smiling at a banquet or breathing too enthusiastically near a nobleman. Some were slandered, not for anything they did, but for what men imagined they might do. A few became powerful, like Alice Perrers, but were destroyed for it. Many ended up in convents against their will. Some were forced to veil. Some lived in quiet fear of being accused of sorcery.
and almost all were judged by priests, by nobles, by chroniclers, by future historians who wrote about them as if they were decorative vases that caused wars out of spite. Beauty in the Middle Ages was not freedom. It was a fragile crown, constantly slipping, constantly cursed, and often handed out to women who just wanted to be left alone. Let your thoughts settle softly. We're drifting closer to the end of this quiet journey. But don't worry, there's still more to explore. More strange cases, more quiet tragedies, more moments where beauty became a medieval liability. Beauty, blame, and the medieval talent for overreacting. Hey everyone, welcome back. If your pillow has settled, your breathing has slowed, and your mind is floating somewhere between listening and softly dissolving, then you're in the perfect place for part 6. Tonight, we're drifting further into the weary patterns of medieval life, specifically the pattern where beauty, something a person has absolutely no control over, became a matter of state security, theological concern, and occasionally full-scale emotional collapse. So take a breath, let the room feel a little dimmer, and let's drift gently into more stories of women who never asked to be treated like divine tests or political problems. Just stories, slow, steady, and slightly absurd. Let's drift into one of the most strangely documented cases of accidental political beauty. Elizabeth Bruce, the sister of Robert the Bruce. Elizabeth's beauty was praised so heavily in Scottish chronicles that she may as well have been sculpted by a patriotic stonemason with a nationalistic agenda. She was said to be elegant, composed, radiant, and, of course, dangerously captivating. Because in medieval writing, beauty wasn't enough on its own. It had to be dangerous. If a woman was lovely, someone had to suffer. In Elizabeth's case, it was Elizabeth. During the Wars of Scottish Independence, Elizabeth was captured by the English. Now, medieval London didn't quite know what to do with her. She was a political hostage, yes, but she was also too admired to be treated like a normal prisoner. So the English came up with a compromise that was equal parts cruel and theatrical. She was displayed, publicly, inside a cage, a literal cage, hung from the walls of a castle, like an exotic bird, or perhaps a cautionary display. Her beauty, instead of protecting her, amplified her punishment. The English wanted Scotland to see its adored woman held captive. They wanted a spectacle, and they used her appearance to make the spectacle more cutting. I imagine Elizabeth sitting inside that cage, wrapped in whatever dignity she could salvage, watching people stare at her, not as a person, but as a symbol. She wasn't imprisoned for anything she did. She was imprisoned because of who her brother was, and because her face made her a better prop for humiliation. Her beauty did not help her. It simply made the cruelty more memorable. Sometimes history is quiet and poetic, and sometimes it is deeply tired and lacking any creativity whatsoever. Now, let's drift into a softer, but perhaps more ironic story. The tale of Maria of Brabant, one of the wives of King Louis II of Bavaria. Maria was famously beautiful,
chroniclers described her as shining as a spring dawn, which, for medieval Bavaria, was basically the highest compliment imaginable. And she was charming, smart, well-educated, kind, which made Louis incredibly suspicious. Louis was not the most stable king in Europe. He was prone to paranoia, melancholy, and a lifelong habit of assuming everyone was plotting against him, including people who were literally napping. So when he married Maria, beautiful, accomplished Maria, his mind immediately began inventing imaginary disasters. If she smiled at someone, he panicked. If she received a letter, he panicked harder. If she waited too long before responding to a question, he spiraled. Medieval kings often blamed politics on beauty. Louis blamed his own anxiety on his wife. Eventually, he accused her of adultery. No evidence, no witnesses, just Louis and his inner monologue, which was apparently not friend-shaped. Maria protested. Her family protested. The court protested. Louis executed her anyway, because medieval kings did not enjoy being told they were wrong, or emotional, or overreacting, even when they very obviously were. Maria's beauty was used as evidence against her. Louis argued that because she was beautiful, she must have been unfaithful. The logic was, men like her, therefore she must like them back. A flawless example of medieval reasoning, which operated mostly on feelings and bread. Her execution became a cautionary tale, not about paranoia, but about the dangers of feminine allure. Because in the Middle Ages, a woman's beauty could be used as proof of almost anything, especially guilt. Let's drift onward into a court where beauty caused nothing short of a bureaucratic meltdown. The Burgundian court of the 15th century was a place of magnificent clothing, expensive tapestries, and constant interpersonal catastrophes. And at the heart of one such catastrophe was Agnes Sorel, the mistress of King Charles VII of France. Agnes was described as so beautiful that men argued about her cheekbones like philosophers. She was elegant, fashionable, and had what we might call an excellent sense of medieval aesthetics. Unfortunately, she was also Charles's favorite, which meant she instantly became the favorite of everyone else. Nobles despised her, queens despised her, clerics naturally despised her the most. Her beauty was blamed for everything: the king's distraction, political failures, tax issues, the weather. A monk famously wrote an entire sermon arguing that Agnes's face was responsible for the decline of royal virtue, which is a very polite way of saying, I dislike her, and also women in general. One bishop claimed her beauty bewitched the king, which we all know is medieval code for she's effective at her job and I'm upset. Agnes was the first woman in French history to be called the official royal mistress, a title that made her both powerful and perpetually hated. She died young, possibly from illness, possibly from poisoning. Medieval sources disagree, as they often do. But after her death, something remarkable happened. The king fell apart. He mourned her openly, emotionally, in a way that medieval men were not supposed to do. And suddenly nobles realized that Agnes might not have been the manipulative demon they'd accused her of being. She may have just been loved. But her beauty was the part they remembered, not her work, not her kindness, not her influence, just the way she looked and the trouble society thought that caused.
Let's drift now into quieter waters, a softer story, one tinged with exhaustion rather than drama. In medieval Spain, there was a noblewoman named Constanza of Leon, who was so admired that poets wrote about her long after she died. Constanza never sought attention. She lived a peaceful life, she married well, she kept out of political arguments, but her beauty created problems anyway. Every time something happened in court, a jealous rivalry, an unexpected feud, a marriage scandal, someone inevitably whispered, well, Constanza's beauty must have something to do with it. Her face became a catch-all explanation for interpersonal conflict. She once complimented another woman's dress, and for months afterwards a rumor circulated that she was secretly trying to undermine her woman's marriage. Constanza tried being quieter. She tried being less visible. She tried wearing simpler clothes. None of it helped, because the problem wasn't her. It was the medieval talent for inventing stories about women, especially beautiful women, who were easier to accuse because they were easier to notice. Constanza lived gently, but she was remembered dramatically. Such is the nature of medieval chronicles, never letting truth ruin a perfectly convenient story. Let's drift into a final case for tonight, a strange one. In the Byzantine Empire, there was a noblewoman named Maria of Antioch, famed for her beauty, her grace, and her extremely unfortunate timing. She became Empress of Byzantium during one of the empire's more chaotic phases, which is impressive considering that Byzantium spent most of its existence in a nearly perpetual state of chaos. Maria was Western European, blonde, fair, foreign, which the Byzantine elites found deeply suspicious. Her beauty made her stand out, and standing out in Constantinople was essentially the same thing as volunteering to become a political scapegoat. Whenever decisions went wrong, someone blamed the empress. Whenever the treasury struggled, someone blamed the empress. Whenever there was a rumor, rebellion, or minor weather inconvenience, someone pointed to Maria and said something vaguely accusatory involving sorcery or seduction. She tried to be diplomatic. She practiced the language. She adapted. But she never overcame the two obstacles she was born with. She was beautiful, and she was foreign. In Byzantium, either of those was enough to make you a target. Having both was like walking into a council meeting wearing a sign that said, "Please blame me for everything." And the Byzantines did. Eventually, she was overthrown, imprisoned, and executed. Her beauty used as retroactive evidence that she was a manipulator. Even chroniclers sympathetic to her wrote strange things like, "She would have been a good empress if only she had been less fair," which is certainly a sentence. So what do all these stories tell us? That medieval beauty was not a blessing. It was a narrative, a performance, a tool, a threat, a plot device. Men feared it, women were punished for it, and the world treated beauty like a moral weakness instead of a neutral physical trait. In the Middle Ages, beauty was a silent storm that followed women everywhere, one they never asked for and never learned how to escape. Some used it, some hid from it, some suffered because of it, some were destroyed by it, but none of them were allowed to simply have it.
Drifting through the aftermath. What became of the too beautiful in the quiet corners of history? Hey everyone, welcome back. If you're still awake tonight, which I do admire, let's drift a little deeper into the softer, quieter edges of our story. We've moved through the courts, the monasteries, the accusations, and the strange,
slightly tragic ironies that surrounded medieval women who were labeled too beautiful. But beauty, especially the kind recorded by self-important clerics, is a temporary thing. So for this next part, let's just glide into the aftermath, the quiet years, the part nobody writes about because it isn't dramatic enough for court gossip or moral treatises or scandalous chronicles. But you and I, we appreciate the quieter corners, the dim-lit ones, perfect for drifting off. So let's settle in, and let's take one last slow walk among the lives shaped by looks they didn't choose. The women who tried to disappear. Not all of these women ended up queens or heretics or abducted by bishops with more power than sense. Some simply slipped away. A surprising number of dangerously beautiful women decided that the smartest path was the quietest one. Medieval documents occasionally mention women who took vows not out of religious devotion, but as a kind of social camouflage. Monasteries weren't just spiritual shelters. They were, unintentionally, very effective witness protection programs. One chronicler from the 13th century complains, softly in that clerical way, about women of worldly loveliness who seek the veil not for God, but for privacy, which is one of the gentlest ways of saying they came here so men would leave them alone. And honestly, who can blame them? A convent had rules. Men, less so. And if you happen to be known for a face that caused local meltdowns, locking yourself behind a grill and learning to illuminate manuscripts probably sounded like a reasonable retirement plan. Some of these women rose to surprising levels of influence, abbesses with decisiveness that made bishops nervous. Nothing terrifies a medieval clergyman like a smart woman with land rights, especially one he used to accuse of leading men astray simply by existing. It must have been deeply satisfying for them, quietly, softly, without saying a word, the quiet marriages to calm, unimportant men. Another path was marriage, not to princes or counts or overly ambitious nobles, but to men with no political aspirations whatsoever. Imagine a woman once whispered about in courts and taverns, suddenly married to a man whose biggest concern is whether the new barley crop looks promising. It probably felt like paradise. These retreat marriages, as one modern historian calls them, were surprisingly common. Families would arrange them deliberately. A pretty daughter attracted too much attention? Simple solution. Marry her off to someone very dull, very kind, very unthreatening, very invisible to the world. The documents often describe these husbands with adjectives like moderate, practical, and unremarkable, which, if we're honest, sound like the medieval equivalents of, I fall asleep during my own stories. But those were probably the safest households for a woman whose beauty had turned to life into a public problem. The rhythm of their days was simple: chickens, candles, weather, a cow that keeps behaving suspiciously, and a husband who thinks court intrigue is a type of mushroom. Some chroniclers treat these women as tragic for falling from high prospects, but honestly, some of them likely slept better than queens. When beauty changes and the world forgets. There's another quiet truth about medieval beauty. It didn't last long, not because these women aged faster, but because the standard of beauty was wildly unstable. A woman described as too beautiful at 20 could be written off as adequate at 35 and forgotten entirely by 40. Time, childbirth, sun exposure, illness, and the absence of medieval skincare all did their slow, patient work. And once the public fascination faded, so did most of the danger. Historians sometimes stumble across references to a woman who was once considered an irresistible menace, only to later find a document describing her simply as widow, lives by the west gate, keeps 2 geese, known for her onion soup, which is oddly comforting. To go from being treated like a walking catastrophe to being known for your cooking means life finally had the decency to calm down. The women who outlived the men obsessed with them. Here's a quiet pattern. A lot of the men who proclaimed women dangerously beautiful did not live very long. Medieval medicine was, let's say, experimental. Many women outlived the men who tried to shame them. Priests died of fevers, nobles died of infections acquired from extremely poor decisions, and soldiers died of everything, always. And the women? Some simply kept going, running homes, raising children, managing farms, and occasionally giving the kind of tired, amused sighs that only someone who outlived several problematic men can give. A later chronicler might mention them briefly, as his widows survived him by many years. No explanation, no drama, just a quiet fact. But we can imagine her sitting by a small hearth, stirring a pot, thinking, "Remember when they said I was a threat to society? That was exhausting." And then going back to her soup.
The women whose stories became legends. Of course, some stories didn't fade quietly. Over time, storytellers exaggerated these women into myths, ladies so beautiful they caused battles, or started wars, or ruined kingdoms. The truth was always simpler. Men made poor decisions and needed someone to blame. But the legends grew anyway. And many of these women, long after they were gone, became symbols rather than people. Some were portrayed as seductresses, others as victims, a few as saintly figures whose beauty reflected divine favor, and none of them had the ability to correct any of it. That's the thing about beauty-based legends. The real woman disappears completely, and only the reflection remains, a reflection shaped by men who liked to moralize, dramatize, and, when possible, avoid responsibility at all costs. In a way, the legends tell us less about the women and more about the medieval imagination, which had the subtlety of a dropped anvil. The women who left no trace at all. And then there are the silent ones, women who were accused, judged, whispered about, but whose names didn't survive. A scribe looked at their lives and decided they were not worth recording, which sounds harsh, but it's also strangely peaceful. To vanish from the written record is to slip out of reach of gossip, of scrutiny, of historians who insist on explaining your life in footnotes. They moved through their villages, raised children, planted herbs, shared bread, sat by small windows during long winter evenings, and nobody wrote a single sentence about them. Their lives were anonymous, ordinary, and probably much quieter than the legends of dangerous beauty we hear about today. History tends to spotlight the loudest stories, but sleep comes easier when we remember the quiet ones too. Drifting toward the other side of beauty. As we move toward the end of this long, slow wander through medieval anxieties, it's worth noting something. Being called too beautiful was rarely about beauty. It was about fear, control, projection, blaming women for the behavior of men. A medieval pastime, really, right up there with poor hygiene and questionable medical advice. But when you look closely, most of the women affected by these accusations ended up carving out strangely peaceful lives. Not glamorous, not famous, not tragic epics sung by bards. Just human lives, shaped by time, softened by routine, and lived mostly outside the reach of the men who once found them too distracting. Some became nuns, some became wives, some became legends, and many simply became people again, which, frankly, might be the happiest ending medieval Europe ever offered. If you're still awake at this point, you're a resilient sleeper. But that's all right. We'll drift a little further in the next part, gently unraveling the roots of these old beauty panics.
The roots of fear. Why medieval beauty was a threat.
Hey everyone, welcome back. If you're still awake, let's drift a little deeper, not into specific women this time, but into the strange, slow logic of medieval society itself. Because understanding the world these women lived in helps explain why their beauty was so often treated like a public crisis. So take a breath, adjust your pillow, and let's drift into the quieter, subtler currents beneath the stories we've been following. Why beauty became dangerous. Medieval society had a very particular worldview. Everything, of course, was ordered by God, or so everyone said. In a world where divine will was considered visible in every leaf, river, and eyebrow, beauty was complicated. A beautiful woman could be seen as a blessing from God, a test from God, a temptation from the devil, and often all three at once. Imagine living your life knowing that every glance at your reflection might be interpreted as a cosmic moral statement. Exhausting, right? Because men were considered morally weak by default, women's beauty became a social safety hazard, and medieval thinkers decided they had to regulate it. Hence all the sermons about modesty, the veils, the veiled threats, the entire apparatus of policing female attractiveness. It was society saying, in the calmest, most serious way possible, don't look at her too closely. Don't let her look at you. And if anything goes wrong, we're blaming her. Fear of female influence. One reason beauty was considered threatening, influence. A pretty woman in court could inspire loyalty, admiration, or mild distraction. Men might defer to her, seek her counsel, or just honestly notice her too much. Medieval society had no framework for women exercising soft influence. Power was assumed to be hard, military, and male. So a woman who could sway opinion without violence, she was a problem. Chroniclers recorded countless instances where political mistakes were blamed on women bewitching men with their charm, even if the mistake was a direct result of mismanaged finances, bad weather, or sheer incompetence. Women's faces were easier to blame. Think of it as a medieval scapegoat algorithm. Input, male failure. Process, blame female beauty. Output, moral panic, political chaos, a few sermons, and possibly an exile or forced convent. The intersection of beauty and marriage politics. Marriage was, of course, the most direct way beauty became a problem. Dynastic marriages were less about love or companionship, and more about alliances, land, and political advantage. A beautiful daughter was a powerful asset, and a liability at the same time. Too plain, her family might struggle to secure an advantageous match. Too beautiful, she might inspire jealousy, temptation, or even rebellion. There are multiple recorded cases where women were essentially locked away until a suitable political marriage could be arranged. Sometimes it took years, sometimes decades. During that time, the woman's life was partially suspended, forced to follow strict court rules, observed constantly, often blamed for things she hadn't done. It's an exhausting pattern, but medieval elites were remarkably consistent when it came to worrying about appearances. The moral panics around beauty. Beauty wasn't just political, it was moral. Theologians feared that too many attractive women in one city could undermine the virtue of men. A particularly lovely woman might be cited as evidence of a society in moral decline. Clerics wrote treatises about the dangers of excessive ornamentation or bewitching smiles. One 14th century sermon reads almost like a bedtime warning. Beware the gaze of her eyes, for they can ensnare the hearts of men, and thus the kingdom falters. Notice the logic. Men fail morally. Women are beautiful. Women cause the failure.
The victim here is always the woman. She didn't cause the sin. She merely existed in the wrong social category. Visible, human, lovely. Why these stories persist? Why do we still hear about women whose beauty caused problems? Because it's dramatic. Because it fits neatly into the narrative of medieval chaos. Because historians, chroniclers, and poets loved a simple moral tale. Beautiful woman appears, men are distracted, kingdom suffers, lesson, women must be controlled. It's an appealingly simple story, much easier than trying to explain centuries of political mismanagement, famine, or miscommunication. And so, centuries later, the stories of women like Isabel of France, Alice Perrers, and Agnes Sorel endure, often stripped of context and remembered for the beauty that supposedly caused trouble. The women themselves? Often lost to history. Their intentions, desires, and daily lives largely invisible. Which is why stories like these are both fascinating and quietly sad. Because in every account of a too beautiful woman, the real story is about the society that feared her existence. Quiet reflections. Take a moment. Think about the countless women who never made it into the chronicles, who lived quietly, who married dull men on purpose, who joined convents to escape scrutiny, who survived by fading into ordinary life. These are the ones who outlived the panic, who outlived the gossip, who outlived the fear. And in their quiet, unremarkable lives, they probably found a peace that no chronicler ever wrote about. Drifting toward closure. So, as we slowly drift toward the end of tonight's journey, remember this. Medieval beauty was rarely about aesthetics. It was about power. It was about fear. It was about control. And the women who were too beautiful did not create the chaos. They endured it. They navigated suspicion, exile, forced marriage, moral panic, and political manipulation. And many of them survived. Some quietly, some tragically, but almost all of them with a grace that history is only beginning to notice. Take another slow breath.
let your mind settle, and know that while the chronicles remembered only the legend, there were countless real women behind it, living, resisting, enduring. And that, perhaps, is the most soothing thought of all.
Reflections and the gentle end of the tale. Hey everyone! Welcome back for the final stretch of our slow drift through medieval lives, beauty, and the curious ways societies responded to women who were too beautiful. If you're still with me, it's time to gently settle into the quietest corners of the story. The reflections, the lessons, and the moments of calm that history rarely highlights. So, adjust your pillow, take a slow breath, and let us float softly toward the end. The patterns we've seen. Over the last several hours, we've wandered through courts, convents, and small villages. We've met queens, princesses, mistresses, and anonymous women who never made the chronicles. And one pattern keeps recurring. Beauty was never neutral. It was a tool, a weapon, a threat. Some women suffered directly. Some escaped quietly. Some became legends that no longer resemble the people they once were. Medieval society didn't merely notice beauty. It reacted to it, overreacted to it, and often blamed it for things it had no part in. And through it all, the women endured, silently, gracefully, cleverly. They survived where others would have perished, sometimes literally, sometimes socially. Quiet lives behind loud histories. The chroniclers loved drama. They wanted wars, scandals, and moral lessons. The quieter stories rarely made it to parchment. Yet most women who were considered too beautiful did not topple kingdoms or seduce men into catastrophe. They baked bread. They tended gardens. They bore children. They managed estates. And in that quiet endurance, there is something profoundly soothing to imagine. The chaos, the moral panics, the accusations, they fade. All that remains is a woman living her life as best she could. Perhaps she laughed softly at the absurdity of it all. Perhaps she sighed when chroniclers misrepresented her. Perhaps she simply lived. And in imagining these lives, we can let go of tension and let ourselves drift as well.
The irony of medieval beauty obsession. One of the more ironic aspects of this history is how thoroughly men controlled the narrative about women's looks. Beauty caused wars, stirred jealousy, or inspired moral panic, but only because men interpreted it that way. The women themselves had no say in the stories that would define them. And yet, the women adapted. They navigated danger with intelligence, wit, and patience. They survived systems designed to limit them. They found small victories in the margins. There is a quiet heroism in that. Not the kind sung by bards or celebrated in chronicles, but the kind that persists quietly across centuries if you know where to look. Lessons from history. If we pause for a moment, there are gentle lessons here for us, too. Society's fears are often projected on those who simply exist. Reputation can be as fragile as perception. Survival sometimes requires patience, subtlety, and grace. The loudest stories are rarely the most accurate, and often quiet endurance is the most extraordinary form of resilience. As we imagine these women living, enduring, fading, or resisting,
we can breathe a little more slowly. We can let the tension of the court, the accusations, and the moral tonic dissolve, and we can recognize that history is not just about spectacular events. It's about quiet human lives navigating impossible circumstances. The gentle conclusion. So as we drift toward the end of tonight's journey, think of the women we've met, the queens who smiled through scrutiny, the mistresses who outlived gossip, the anonymous daughters who vanished into convents and villages. They lived despite the world's obsession with appearances. They endured the chaos, the suspicion, and the false accusations. And in their quiet survival, they reclaimed their humanity. The medieval obsession with beauty tells us more about fear than about women. And perhaps that is the softest thought we can leave with, that human lives, even under immense pressure, find ways to endure, even when history misremembers them. Take a final slow breath. Feel the calm settle in. The world of medieval courts, conspiracies, and excessive admiration drifts away. What remains is peace, a quiet understanding, and a gentle acknowledgement of human resilience. Let your eyes close. Let the stories dissolve into soft sleep, and carry with you the calm endurance of those women who lived quietly through history in a world that often refused to leave them alone. Good night.